Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. Today I want to take you on a long, thoughtful journey into a scenario that has felt almost impossible for years, but one that, in some corners of the world, is quietly gaining ground. The idea that Crimea, the peninsula annexed by Russia after 2014, might one day fall back to Ukraine. What would that look like? What would it mean for Ukraine, for Russia, for the global order, for ordinary people? Let's explore what that world could be like, what might bring it about, and what the repercussions could be. This is a speculative but serious conversation, a thought experiment, and maybe a roadmap for justice. Imagine for a moment that the guns fall silent along the front lines, that diplomacy begins to take hold, that under pressure from sanctions, from global condemnation, from internal economic strain, or from a shift in Russian politics, the occupying power begins to withdraw. Maybe over months, maybe years, and step by step, the peninsula formerly known as Crimea is handed back to Ukraine. Ukrainian flags rise over government buildings. Ukrainian citizenship is restored for residents who accept it. Ukrainian institutions begin the slow, delicate process of reintegration. For Ukraine, this would be nothing short of a moral and political vindication, a restoration of territorial integrity that reinforces the principle, one so basic in international law, that no power can legitimately seize and hold another's land by force. For the Ukrainian people, especially those who lost homes, rights, livelihoods, or loved ones under occupation, it would be a long overdue chance at redemption and return. Evicted families could go back. Schools and hospitals shuttered or repurposed might reopen. Cultural institutions, museums, theaters, local media might reemerge. The language, customs, traditions suppressed or marginalized during the occupation could be revived. The healing would not be instant, but for many it would be deeply symbolic. And for a generation born in conflict, the possibility of a future rooted in their homeland with security, normalcy, and dignity would be a powerful incentive to rebuild lives. But integrating Crimea back into Ukraine would be an enormous challenge, not only logistically, but politically, socially, psychologically. The first challenge, governance, establishing local administration that is seen as legitimate by residents. This could be complicated by years of occupation, by the presence of people who collaborated with the previous regime, by those resistant to change, by distrust or bitterness. There would be disputes over property, homes, and land that may have changed hands, businesses that may have been expropriated, factories or farms reorganized, leases changed. Sorting out property rights, reclaiming documentation, validating titles that could take years. Transparency would be essential. Otherwise, corruption could rewrite history all over again, but in new ways. Ukraine would need to establish fair mechanisms for restitution, compensation, and reconciliation. Courts, civil registries, local governments, civil services, all would need to be re-established or restructured. Then comes security. Withdrawal of occupying forces does not mean immediate safety. There might be insurgents, militias, armed gangs, criminal elements, sabotage, or remnants unwilling to give up control. External meddling, covert operations, propaganda, cyber influence might try to destabilize the reintegration. There may be a need for peacekeeping forces, perhaps from international coalitions or neutral parties, to deter interference and protect civilians as trust is rebuilt. That would require robust international coordination, clear mandates, and long-term commitment. Trust building between communities, some of whom may have embraced the old order, and the new Ukrainian administration would be delicate and fragile. Rehabilitation and reconciliation programs would be essential. Psychological counseling, community dialogues, inclusion of minorities, protection for those fearing reprisals. Addressing the trauma of war and occupation, the memory of abuse, and the fear of retribution, all would be necessary if genuine peace is to take hold. But let's say the reintegration succeeds slowly, painfully, yes, but steadily. What comes next? Economically, the possibilities could be significant. Crimea, with its Black Sea coastline, ports, seaside resorts, vineyards, farmland, could once again open to tourism, trade, commerce, agriculture. Infrastructure that may have decayed or been mismanaged under occupation could be rebuilt. Roads, bridges, water systems, power grids, ports, reconstruction efforts could create jobs, attract investment, and generate income. For Ukraine as a whole, restoring Crimea could strengthen its economy, boost regional trade, and open new channels for export and import. For businesses, local and international, there could be opportunities in rebuilding, development, tourism, agriculture, hospitality. Abroad, investors might see Crimea as a nascent frontier ripe for growth, under the umbrella of a rebuilt and legitimate Ukrainian administration. That new economic vitality could provide a lifeline to war-torn communities, revive livelihoods, and offer hope for a stable future. But economic potential alone would not guarantee success. Crimean reintegration would need political stability, fair governance, transparent rule of law, and social reconciliation. Otherwise, poverty, corruption, disenfranchisement, all risks from large-scale transitions could erode trust again. Reconstructed cities might look fine on the outside, but inside, communities could remain fractured. If economic gains go to a few elites, while ordinary people remain marginalized, grievances could simmer. That is why rebuilding must be egalitarian, inclusive, and community-centered, not just reconstruction of buildings, but reconstruction of trust, dignity, and social cohesion. Internationally, a restored Crimea under Ukraine would send a powerful message. It would reaffirm the sovereignty of nations, the inviolability of borders, and the primacy of international law over might. It could reshape regional security. For neighboring states, especially those bordering the Black Sea, the shift could alter strategic postures, alliances, and defense calculations. A successful reintegration could set a precedent, a warning to aggressor states that annexations may not be permanent, that occupation may be reversed, and that international pressure, economic, diplomatic, military, can eventually pay off. This could embolden other nations resisting aggression, occupations, or territorial grabs worldwide. Moreover, it could revitalize institutions like the United Nations, international courts, and human rights bodies. Their principles, which for many can appear abstract, would be validated in real, tangible outcomes. That kind of global demonstration might strengthen deterrence mechanisms, encourage global norms of peaceful conflict resolution, and discourage unilateral territorial aggression. If just once, maybe the first time occupation is undone, it could change behavior internationally. Aggressors might think twice before seizing territory. Occupiers might fear long-term consequences. The world might become more vigilant, more principled. But of course, there are risks and dark paths too. For some, a Ukrainian-run Crimea would feel like betrayal, loss of identity, fear of reprisals. Some Crimeans may have built their lives under the occupation regime, invested, benefited, adapted. Losing that status overnight could upend their lives. Some may fear retribution for perceived collaboration. That could fuel resentment, sabotage, resistance from within. If not handled with empathy, sensitivity, and justice, the reintegration could sow seeds for a prolonged insurgency. Heavy-handed reprisals or policies of collective punishment would only exacerbate divisions. A policy of inclusiveness, protections for minorities, safeguards for human rights, these would be essential. Truth, transparency, and reconciliation, not revenge, would have to guide the process. Otherwise, the scars of occupation could give birth to new grievances. Politically, for Ukraine's government, embracing such a complex restructuring could be a minefield. Nationalist passions, trauma, calls for justice might demand swift actions, but swift actions risk mistakes. Mistakes could fuel discontent, cause new injustices. The government would need to balance the need for accountability with fairness, justice with reconciliation, not easy. International pressure might also push for quick results, but real healing and reintegration take time. There would be tension between domestic expectations and global patience, and there would be resources, financial, administrative, human capital, required at enormous scale. Where would they come from? International donors, Ukraine itself, public debt, aid programs, investments. All would need careful coordination, planning, and transparent management. Imagine also the cultural and psychological dimension. People living through occupation, war, displacement, some may have left decades ago. Some may have been born elsewhere. Others may have lived under propaganda, under forced loyalty, under fear. When Ukrainian administration returns, identity would be complex. Some may identify as Russian, others Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar or Eurasian, or with no defined identity. Reintegration would have to account for that diversity, not just impose a monolithic narrative. Schools and educational curricula would need revision. Languages, religions, cultural heritage, all would need respect and space. In towns and villages, there may be generational divides. Older people nostalgic for the past, younger ones wanting integration. There may be trauma, mistrust, memories of violence, loss, discrimination. Healing those wounds would take time. Community programs, inter-ethnic dialogues, cultural events, memorials for victims all would help, but require resources, goodwill, and vision. The media, too honest journalism, free speech, openness would be necessary to rebuild trust and avoid the return of propaganda or misinformation. Transparency in public affairs, accountability, public participation, civic institutions would need to be rebuilt almost from scratch. But if this fragile roadmap succeeds, Crimea under Ukraine could become a symbol, not of loss, but of redemption. A place where war did not become permanent, a place where occupation was reversed, but not replaced with revenge, instead with reconciliation, renewal, hope. A beacon of what justice and international solidarity can achieve. For the people living there, it could be a chance to rebuild their lives. For Ukraine, a return to wholeness. For the world, a demonstration that aggression does not pay in the long run, that sovereignty, rights, and human dignity can triumph over force and occupation. Think also about the global geopolitical consequences for alliances, for military strategy, for diplomacy. The return of Crimea to Ukraine might force regional powers, defense blocs, and strategic actors to reevaluate their positions. Naval access to the Black Sea, airfields, military bases. These may shift, change hands, or be decommissioned. For international trade routes, shipping lanes, energy transport, there could be new realignments. For global powers, this could require recalibration of influence and presence in the region. For humanitarian organizations and global institutions, it could be an opportunity to demonstrate their capacity to support reconstruction, human rights, justice, reconciliation. And for civil society globally, it could be a rallying point. Human rights activists, peace builders, diaspora communities, NGOs all could mobilize to support a just reintegration and healing process. Yet, for every hopeful path, there remains possibility of relapse. What if reintegration fails partially? If corruption undermines reconstruction? If economic gains end up in few hands? If resentment festers? If security cracks remain? Then Crimea could end up in limbo, nominally part of Ukraine, but divided socially, economically, culturally, a region forgotten, marginalized, resentful. That could undo much of the moral and political gains. For Ukraine, it could become a burden instead of a restoration. For locals, a place of disappointment and hardship. For the world, a cautionary tale that even when occupation is reversed, peace is not automatic, so the stakes are enormous. It is a gamble, not just for power or land, but for humanity, dignity, justice. Because ultimately, the question is not just who controls the land, but who controls the future. Do the residents of Crimea get to decide their future? Do they get safety, rights, hope? Do they get the chance to rebuild, to thrive, to belong? Not because they submit, but because they are home again. And does the world, states, institutions, communities give them that chance? Or does geopolitics again reduce them to pawns? Imagine a child born in Crimea in 2026. She hears stories from grandparents about the old days. She plays by a shore once closed, visits ruins of buildings damaged in war, but also new schools rebuilt, new neighborhoods rising. She feels a sense of belonging not just to a flag or a state, but to a community healing itself. She studies in Ukrainian schools, or maybe in Crimean Tatar, depending on the region. She learns about history, not propaganda, but truth. She hears stories of pain, but also of resilience, hope, reconciliation. She learns that borders can change, but human dignity should not. She grows up with the possibility of a future grounded in peace, opportunity, identity. That future would be a silent but powerful victory, not just for her, but for humanity. But this requires global will. It requires the international community to stay engaged, not just in protests and sanctions, but in reconstruction, in humanitarian aid, in capacity building. Diplomatic recognition is important, but so is funding, development, cultural engagement, legal support, truth and reconciliation efforts, civic engagement. Without that ongoing support, the reintegration risks being symbolic rather than real. And symbolic victories, though important, can't build lives. Only long-term commitment, stable institutions, inclusive governance, and empowerment of local communities can. So if Crimea does return to Ukraine, if this long shot becomes reality, the world will need to treat it not as an endpoint, but as the beginning. A beginning of rebuilding, of healing, of justice, of new lives. A test not only of Ukrainian sovereignty, but of global solidarity, of human values, of whether force can truly be reversed by principles, whether occupation can be undone not just on maps, but in hearts and homes, and whether victims of war, once powerless, can become citizens with dignity, agency, and hope. This scenario, dramatic, uncertain, might seem far-fetched to some. Many may call it unrealistic. Many will doubt it, but hope, after all, begins with a vision of justice, dignity, and possibility. And sometimes, visions set the course of history. So I invite you, dear viewers, imagine with me what Crimea returning to Ukraine could mean, not just for governments, but for people, not just for geopolitics, but for human lives. Imagine a return not just of territory, but of rights, of belonging, of healing, of hope. Imagine a land wounded by war, rising again not through vengeance, but through compassion, not through forced assimilation, but through respect, not through domination, but through renewal. Because history shows that even the deepest wounds can heal, even the longest occupations can end, and even when maps change, what matters most is whether people find their homes back, their hopes, their identities, their futures. That is the true meaning of restoration, and maybe, just maybe, that future awaits Crimea. Thank you for being here and listening to this vision. I know it's long, I know it's heavy, but sometimes the most important conversations take time. Please share what you think. What doubts or hopes do you have? What risks do you see? And what do you believe is possible? Let's start a respectful conversation, because if one day this scenario becomes real, we'll all be part of writing the next chapter. Until then, stay thoughtful, stay hopeful, take care.